If you're a hardcore competitive gamer, but you don't want your monitor to look like trash with a TN panel, then you might want to consider something like a fast VA or IPS monitor. And today we're looking at the latter. It's called the Philips Evnia 25M2N5200U, which sports a flat 24.5-inch 390Hz Full HD IPS panel. It also has got Display HDR 400 certification and support for adaptive sync technologies. Now, at the time of filming and in the UK, it can be found for £330. And in this review, you can see if it's actually worth this price tag and, of course, how it performs across the board. So to kick things off, I would like to point out that the monitor has got two HDMI 2.0 ports and a single DisplayPort 1.4 input. The latter will deliver you 1080p at the maximum refresh rate of 360Hz or the overclocked 390Hz, which is factory overclocked in case you're wondering. However, the HDMI ports will disappointingly limit you to 240Hz. It would have been great over here if the manufacturer had included full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, because it would have meant that you would have had a bit more versatility. For example, if you're connecting up this monitor with a laptop that only has HDMI ports, then you're actually going to be capped unless you get an adapter of sorts. Now, nonetheless, I went ahead and did my test over DisplayPort with my desktop computer. And first off, we have to talk about its input lag. And here I was actually really impressed. It is worth noting over here that the low input lag mode was actually enabled. However, in certain instances, for example, when enabling adaptive sync technologies, it actually becomes grayed out. But I didn't actually encounter too many problems even in this sort of scenario. Indeed, while playing a hardcore competitive game such as Counter-Strike 2, I felt that my mouse inputs were responding instantaneously. However, the same sort of praise can't be quite said about the overall response time. In terms of my own subjective opinion, I felt that it was just a little bit lackluster, and it didn't quite compete with some other high refresh rate monitors out there, namely, for example, with the likes of TN panels or indeed OLEDs. In this respect over here, I just felt that the monitor was a little bit sluggish, even in terms of its fastest mode overdrive setting, where normally where you go up the scale, you'll get a worse visual experience, but you'll then get a faster panel. Now, for me to demonstrate it and to give you objective numbers, I'm using the OSRTT tool. And just concentrating on the maximum overdrive setting of fastest, you can see at the bottom left-hand side of your screen at 390Hz, the average initial time clocked in at 3.82 milliseconds. However, just above it, you can see that the percent in window is actually really poor at 56.67%. In other words, the monitor is not actually truly hitting that 390Hz window. If I were to drop the refresh rate to 360Hz, you can see that the percent in window slightly improves to 60%. The average initial time goes to 3.45 milliseconds. Now, if I were to drop it even further, this is where things get a little bit more interesting and in line with what I would expect, namely for an IPS panel. At 300Hz, the percent in window is actually very good at 76.67%, of course, for an LCD panel. And the average initial time is actually quite low at 2.88 milliseconds. And of course, this is on the fastest mode overdrive. Now, you can actually improve this even further by going down to 240Hz, with the percent in window increasing to 80% and the average initial time, which translates again to the average G to G, coming down to 2.94 milliseconds. In other words, when it came to using this monitor, I actually found that using it at a lower refresh rate did yield for better experiences. With that said, you're paying a premium for that high refresh rate 390Hz. And in this instance, it doesn't actually make any sense in terms of splashing out that extra cash in order to get that higher refresh rate. All while that the monitor is not actually able to properly hit that refresh rate window as you would expect. The caveat to this, however, is that at the higher refresh rate range, you have got slightly better motion clarity. Here you can see the UFO ghosting test. And these were all performed in the fastest mode overdrive, and when I had MBR enabled, it was at the maximum level 20. You can see that as we go from 240 to 300Hz, there's a notable increase in terms of the overall motion clarity. And similarly, as we go to 360 and then finally 390Hz, it gets even sharper. Of course, it gets even better when you were to enable MBR, which stands for motion blur reduction. Ultimately over here, it's kind of a toss-up between motion clarity and the actual response time of the monitor. And in all honesty over here, I'd actually prefer to have a faster responding monitor than one that looks even sharper when it comes to panning around certain objects. Now, aside from hardcore competitive gaming, you have also got adaptive sync technologies, in other words AMD FreeSync and Nvidia G-Sync. Now, I was actually able to test the latter because I've got an RTX 3080, and when connected over DisplayPort, I had no sort of flickering or black screen issues on the Nvidia Pendulum demo. Furthermore, I was able to pair this up with HDR at its maximum refresh rate of 390Hz and had no problems whatsoever while playing a game such as Destiny 2. Now, the overall HDR reproduction is nothing to really shout home about because it's only got Display HDR 400 certification. Therefore, it's not actually as bright as some other alternatives out there on the market, albeit at a more expensive price tag. Here, this is still worth pointing out that it will accept an HDR signal, and the overall HDR image actually looked pretty good. In other words, the colors didn't seem to be overblown. And you can actually choose the different HDR modes via the monitor's OSD, and the one I would suggest is indeed Display HDR because it gives you the best sort of color accuracy. Now, in terms of using adaptive sync technologies or indeed HDR, truthfully, if you're a hardcore competitive gamer and you're looking at achieving maximum refresh rate, then I actually suggest disabling all of this because they will allow you to have uncapped frames. And this will effectively give you the best sort of total system latency, not to be confused with the monitor's input lag, and therefore give you the utmost competitive edge when playing a hardcore game. So with the gaming section out of the way, what about when it comes to image quality? Well, as a reminder, you have got a flat 24.5-inch matte-coated IPS panel that runs a resolution of Full HD and a refresh rate that goes up to 390Hz. Now, 3D Monitor's OSD, you have got a dedicated sRGB mode, which is certainly appreciated. It also has got full brightness controls. In said mode, and using my calibrators, I noticed a gamma coverage of 95.1% and a gamma volume of 96.1%. Below you can see how it compares to the standard. The average delta sits at a stonkingly low 0.69, where closer to 0 is perfection, with a maximum delta of just 2.1. So yes, indeed, this is extremely color accurate and can be used for serious image editing or video grading. Its tested contrast ratio came in at 1105 to 1, while the measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target sat at 6987 Kelvin at 100%, which is actually pretty respectable. Equally, when it comes to its gamma curve, it's pretty much bang on to the 2.2 standards. Now, should you not be a photo editor or indeed working in the sRGB color space, you might want to unlock the wider color gamut of this monitor, and therefore disabling the sRGB mode. This will give you a little bit of extra pop, which is certainly appreciated if you're just using this monitor for gaming purposes. So aside from color performance, what about when it comes to brightness? Well, here in HDR, it achieved just shy of the 400 nits required for the Display HDR 400 certification, clocking in at 393 nits. As for SDR, it does actually get pretty bright at 389 nits. In other words, you can use the monitor at roughly 40 to 50% brightness in a bright sunlit room. However, its minimum brightness is actually quite disappointing, getting down to only 97 nits, therefore making it still pretty bright. And therefore, if you're going to be gaming in a completely pitch black environment, you might actually find it is a little bit too bright for your liking. But of course, that is quite subjective. As for the MBR mode, you've got 20 different level increments to choose from, and at its maximum level, it is still actually pretty bright at 165 nits, which I actually quite like. Now moving on, we get onto brightness uniformity, and on my tested panel, it actually did pretty well, although I do appreciate it is somewhat panel lottery, and the same could be said about your overall backlight bleed. Of course, if this is something that you're susceptible to, then you might want to consider another panel technology, such as the likes of an OLED, which will be much more expensive, or more appropriately, a VA or a TN panel. Moving swiftly on, we get onto build quality, and here the 24.5-inch monitor won't take up much space on your desk, not only because of its physical size, but due to the fact you've also got a three-side boltless design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. The stand itself is also very ergonomic, providing you height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments. And yes, you can rotate it in both ways, which is very much appreciated. Should you not want the built-in stand, you can of course replace it with a VESA-compatible one, allowing you to place it on a multi-stand or a multi-monitor setup. Now at the back right-hand side of the monitor, you will notice there's a small little joystick button, and this is to access the monitor's OSD. Allowing you to control pretty much all the settings that you require of the monitor. It's pretty comprehensively laid out, although it can seem sometimes counterintuitive when you're going between the menus. Although once you get your head around it, it becomes second nature. Now as an extension to this, you have also got the Philips Evnia Precision Center software, And yes, indeed, as you might expect, you can also adjust certain settings on the fly. Although you'll probably want to make sure that the USB Type A to Type B cable, which is supplied within the box, is connected to your computer in order for you to access all the settings. Now, on that note, I would like to talk about connectivity. And here you have got that DisplayPort 1.4 and those two HDMI 2.0 ports. But beside it, you've also got a 3.5mm jack, which can be useful for routing audio from the monitor to a set of headphones. You have also got some built-in speakers, which will suffice for basic music or gaming needs, or indeed Windows notifications. Then you've also got 4 USB Type A ports, which can be useful for plugging in your peripherals, or for example, a flash drive. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict of this Philips monitor. And while it does well in terms of providing adaptive sync technologies, HDR, fantastically low input lag, phenomenal color accuracy, a great build quality and a comprehensive OSD, it's very much hard to recommend given its overall price point and the fact that its maximum refresh rate of 360 or even the overclocked 390Hz doesn't perform as you might expect. In fact, over here, it performs better at the lower refresh rate range of, let's say, 240 to 300Hz. At which point you might want to save yourself quite a significant amount of money and buy some of the alternatives out there, which ironically the top ones I would pick are from Philips themselves and also AOC. They'll be down in the description below for your own consideration. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of this monitor down in the comment section below, and of course if you pick it over some of the alternatives that I have mentioned in the description. If you have enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification. All of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.